welcome to this event. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program and Special Advisor to the Mexico Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And want to extend a special welcome to everybody. We had a little AV glitch this morning, but we wanted to get it fixed because there are tens of thousands of people on the World Wide Web listening in, so we wanted to make sure they had access to our event this morning, which we're very excited about. I just want to, I'll introduce them in a minute, but I just want to word of special and distinguished guests, many of which have been here before. We did an event back in 2011 with Sheldon and Gabriela when they were both 15 years old, and so we're delighted to welcome them back. And then, of course, Louise Shelley has been a long-time friend and ally of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was looking back in the archives there, Louise, and it looks like you were a fellow in 1986, is that right?
Probably,
So
yes.
you were probably about 10 back then, I suppose, Wunderkind. But anyway, welcome to all of you, and Victoria, I think this is your first time here, but we're glad that you can be with us. It's also, I'm thrilled to be able to do this event. This is a collaborative event between the Latin American Program and the Mexico Institute, and glad Duncan Wood can join us, Director of the Mexico Institute this morning. One person is not here, which I'm a little bit disappointed about, but it couldn't be helped. It was a scheduling snafu, and that's Dr. Lupita Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, former Wilson Center Fellow and Global Fellow here at the Wilson Center, and also a colleague of Louise's at the Schar School, and also author of a new report that we've just released in the last few days called Arguments to Reform Mexico's Anti-Trafficking Legislation. We copied a few dozen copies, but they're definitely, if there's none left on the back table, they're definitely going to be posted online. I highly recommend it. For those of you who aren't specialists in the issue, Guadalupe does a very good job of trying to help us understand sort of the distinctions between smuggling and trafficking from a legal perspective. And I used to use those words interchangeably, like what difference does it make? But actually there is a profound difference, and she makes the case that in the case of legislation in Mexico, there's some confusion that can actually lead to harm to the victims of smuggling. So I highly recommend this. I'm sorry Guadalupe couldn't be with us. She would have loved to have been. If she sees this on the line, hi Guadalupe, thank you for your terrific work. But we are joined today by a stellar panel that's done a lot of research on this issue. The President's Twitter habits have placed irregular migration front and center in the news cycle across the continent once again. Unfortunately, it may have fed, in my opinion, many misconceptions about migration and irregular migration. A caravan of hundreds of illegal migrants heading north to the United States through Mexico sounds scary. What are they doing? Who are they? Are they dangerous? Why isn't somebody stopping them? Why aren't the Mexicans doing more? The sense of fear surrounding the story was palpable. And there was a really nice little quote in the New York Times today. Let me read it in an interview with one of the caravan participants. Imagine that, said Ms. Contreras, a Honduran factory worker hoping to apply for asylum in the United States. Quote, so many problems he has to solve, and he gets involved with this caravan. It's sort of like we've created a great sense of fear and panic around this, and maybe it's misplaced. Fortunately, we don't have to be driven by the news cycle or by tweets. We have the opportunity today and always here at the Wilson Center to take a deeper look, step back, and analyze, look at the underlying issues around migration and irregular migration. As it turns out, the migrants in the caravan were banding together primarily for protection from abusive authorities in Mexico and or criminal groups. The process of coming north for irregular migrants is fraught with risks: violence, extortion, kidnapping, and exploitation, not to mention health risks, starvation, exhaustion, exposure to the elements. They must either make the journey on their own or in groups or rely on some form of irregular migration facilitation. Traditionally, that has meant coyotes or smugglers, but these traditional actors and systems of movement have been changing over time, not only in Mexico, but across the region. Increasingly, punitive immigration enforcement has altered the traditional landscape of irregular migration facilitation, often to the detriment of migrants and their safety. These shifts have changed the smuggling business and its organization, altered the roles of migrants in the marketplace, and means they will face additional criminal risks. Our speakers today will present findings from their research in South and Central America, Mexico, and the U.S.-Mexican border. Let me introduce each one of them very briefly. There are fuller bios on the back table and online, but I'll introduce them very briefly and then ask each of them to make their presentation. We'll wrap up the presentations with commentary from really an international expert on these issues, Dr. Louise Shelley from the Schar School at GMU, and then we'll have time, hopefully plenty of time, for a conversation with you all, so prepare your questions. We're going to begin by hearing from Dr. Victoria Stone-Cadena. She's the Associate Director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York. And she's going to talk about coyoterismo in the Americas, the myths of mobility. And papers backing these presentations are also available online and in the back. After Dr. Stone, we'll hear from Dr. Gabriela Sanchez. She's a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center, the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. And she will talk about care, protection, and support during smuggling journeys in the Central America, Mexico, U.S.-Mexico border migration corridor. Then we'll hear from Dr. Sheldon Shang. He is the chair and professor of the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. And he will be talking about migrant smuggling and its convergence with other illicit markets along the U.S.-Mexican border. And then, as I say, we'll hear from Dr. Louise Shelley. She's the Omer L. and Nancy Hurst Endowed Chair and Director, Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, the Schar School of Policy and Government at the George Mason University. So thank you all, and we'll hear first from Dr. Stone. Or did I get the order mixed up? Huh? Oh, okay, we're going to hear first from Sheldon.
All right. Good morning. I'm Sheldon Zhang. Together with Gabriela and also Luigi, who's not here, the three of us spent much of the last year putting together a special issue of the Annals, where our editor there, Tom, there's really spent a lot of time shepherding this project. We're presenting only the Latin American portion today, but it is reflections of our a collective work from many parts of the world about migrant smuggling and the various aspects of how migrants utilize resources at their own disposal and collaborate and move towards their desired destination. Can you have my first slides on? So I can give the audience some guidelines on where we are. Next slide. The background or the main cause for us to launch this project was really in response to the binary perspective, the dominant narratives. In the news media, government reports, or the most of the conversation we have about the global migrant smuggling largely is fixed around this one dominant theme. Thank you. Which is, I mean, they're unscrupulous and ruthless criminal groups and preying on vulnerable people who are trying to get to, try to improve their lot and their economic situation. Largely, this whole theme just runs across most of the government narratives. And now we understand that. This is probably because of the a necessity, a policy statement in response to the control regimes around the world. U.S. is not alone. You can also get the idea from the amount of resources the Western countries pour into controlling their borders and maintaining restrictions against invasions of foreigners. But however, as field researchers, the authors that we got together and that published a special social networks of these people or all individuals, and then they get to use these resources, and collectively they move towards their desired destination. So what we found is really it's a complex symbiotic relationships between migrants and smugglers, and there's really no clear image of this evil smugglers and out there and trying to prey on smugglers and waiting for people to fall into their net, and so they can cannibalize these poor souls along the trafficking routes. So we got together and put this collection of articles together, and I hope if you have a chance, you can go online and download it. I'm sure most of you have institutional connections with the annals. And then I'm going to move on to Victoria, and she's going to present her piece on Coyote, and Gabriela, and we'll close out with our collective piece on our assessments of the supposedly convergence of the smuggling and drug trafficking organizations along the U.S. and Mexico border. All right, your turn, Victoria.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I want to extend my gratitude to Gabriela, Sheldon, and Luigi, who wasn't able to join us today, as the editors of the recent special issue on migrant smuggling practices in the Annals Journal, around which our presentations will be made today. I am incredibly grateful to have been part of this project and to be able to think across disciplines, because this is very much an interdisciplinary project, to see how our research coincides in our understanding of migrant smugglers globally. This is an important contribution and quite timely given recent news and the current political environment around immigration. As well, I'd like to thank Eric Olson and the Latin American Program for organizing this event. Thank you for the introduction. A bit about myself. I am a sociocultural anthropologist by training and have conducted extensive fieldwork in Ecuador and with Ecuadorian migrant families in the U.S. for the past 10 years. My research focus is on indigenous migration from Latin America to the United States, and more recently, I've begun to work with Ecuadorian activist youth in the U.S. I've served as an expert witness and organized a series of workshops on migration in New York City, which brought together political officials, immigration lawyers, scholars, activists, and people who work at detention centers in the New York City area. Currently, I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Just a very brief plug. For the past 15 years, the center has produced quantitative data reports on the Latino population in New York City and nationwide. These are free and open to the public, cover a range of topics, including citizenship status, income levels, education levels, healthcare access, home ownership, etc. I welcome you to visit our page and contact us if you're interested in any specific data. While the other journal contributors could not join us today, I want to acknowledge in particular my co-author, Soledad Alvarez, for her contribution to our article on historicizing mobility, coyoterismo, in the indigenous migration industry. There's a copy outside, which we're grateful you can read. I'm just gonna see this slide. No, wrong way. Okay. Within contemporary national and international discourses on migration, as Sheldon was introducing, migration brokers or facilitators, known across the Americas as coyotes, are continually cast as entrepreneurial criminals, discursively framed as cold-hearted and profit-driven, offsetting critical analyses of the role of nation-states in the global targeted development of migration controls. In our historical analyses of the migration strategies of many migrants and the coyotes involved, our ethnographic findings counter this prevailing discourse around the criminalization of coyoterismo, coyotaje, terms that are used interchangeably throughout the Americas to describe the practice of migrant facilitation. This contribution does not intend to minimize the very real experiences of danger and vulnerability faced by migrants en route, and even for coyotes themselves, who pass through regions in Mexico that are controlled by gangs who have extorted migrants and coyotes if they do not enter with what's called a piso, or a paid arrangement for safe passage. But it does give a more nuanced view of smuggling practices. It is not my intention to make policy recommendations today. I will leave that to my colleagues and for further reading in the journal. Rather, I will speak to what gets produced by policies and practice in the Andean region and the migration corridor to the United States. This is a diverse migration, constituted of people fleeing violence and economic hardships brought about by social, political, and environmental factors. Fundamentally, they are people in search of better lives. And in many cases, they seek to be reunited with family members already in the United States. Clandestine family reunification is one of the rising demographics of migration, and they are more at risk than others. In many countries with a long history of migration, children of parents who have migrated often see migration to the United States as the most viable option. Parents send money to the families, but often settle in their places of destination, sometimes having more children, and they seek ways to bring families together in the United States. This is the case of Noemi Alvarez. I believe Gabriela will speak a little bit about her story shortly. People who traverse the migration corridor and attempt to cross into the United States are not all from Latin America either, but are also from Caribbean countries and also Northern African countries. As my co-author and I stress, it is critical to understand these journeys in social and cultural context. Indeed, facilitators of human mobility and human movement have played a role in Southern Highland Ecuador for generations. The history of internal, regional, and international migration varies across the Americas, and this does have an influence on the migration strategies undertaken. Yatzil Guevara, who is also a contributor in the journal, speaks about some of those strategies in historical context in her contribution as well. Many of these migration trajectories date well back over 60 years, and they need to be understood in this context. Be it regional migration between Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, or Caribbean or transcontinental migration from northern African countries to Ecuador and Brazil, as they begin their route over lands to the United States, human smuggling is an integral part of the informal economies throughout the region. My presentation is as much about coyoterismo in the Americas as it is to stress the need to reflect on what policies in practice and those not enforced, those developed to protect the rights of people as they move, produce in terms of migration flows and strategies. Because I only have a brief time, I want to pose two main questions, and these are similar to the questions that many of the other authors have addressed, and I encourage you to read them for their insights. So the main questions I have: how have policy changes throughout the region impacted migration, and how effective are they at stemming migration? And the second question is more about what roles do facilitators play in communities, because they do rely on social networks, and how have their strategies changed over the past 10 years? To the first question, anti-migration policies have not effectively deterred migration flows, and I would argue they will not in the future. Rather, they have created more precarious conditions and make migrants more vulnerable as they seek alternative routes. As migration control throughout the region target human smugglers and migrants, detaining and sending people back in a costly and inefficient process, new strategies are developed, alternative routes sought, and costs increase. On the level of networks and the wide range of service providers on the ground, the migration industry, which I will kind of break down a little bit shortly, develops out of a need to strategize in reaction to this increased vigilance and pressure. Rather than target small-scale networks of human smuggling, migration policies, and this is a big task, should address larger economic, political, and environmental factors that compel migration. Indeed, the largest decline in migration flows to the United States over the past 10 years occurred during times of economic downturns. So kind of a very brief outline of some of the policy and broader changes resulting in evolving migration strategies throughout the region. Clearly, the adoption of the North American Free Trade Agreement. We see the reinforcement of the U.S.-Mexican border post 9/11, the war against drug trafficking undertaken by Mexico in 2006 under then Mexican President Fox, increasing crime rates in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, increasing pressure stemming from the United States to secure the southern Mexican border under the Plan Sur program and the Southern Border Program. In the Andean region, we have a political crisis in Venezuela and the lingering effects of the drug war in Colombia. In Ecuador, which this is a very interesting policy change, they adopted a constitutional platform of free human mobility under the Ecuadorian Organic Law of Human Mobility, which is kind of reissued in 2017. I want to reflect for a moment on the term migration industry, which many of the journal contributors have used. And many of the scholars, the migration industry, emphasizes the important role of intermediaries in both facilitating migration flows, but also in controlling them. It refers to de facto institutionalized sets of processes and operations around human mobility. Primarily, it refers to state institutions whose project is to deter migration flows and detain migrants and these have flourished. It includes operations such as travel agencies, consular offices that are handling visa applications, airlines who transport detained would-be migrants to their countries of origin, migrant safe houses along the route, detention centers, etc. It also refers to the constellations of migrant facilitators who serve a variety of functions. I think we were talking about coyotes, but there are also many players in this understanding of coyoterismo. You have transporters, you have people who are running safe houses, you have intermediaries who will lend you their cell phone for a small fee. We have people who are providing food to communities of solidarity that provide food to migrants en route. Just so we understand, this is a broad constellation of people involved. And I just want to go here. Okay, this is a long quote, so I'm going to give you a moment to read through it. But I will explain this particular quote. Can you read it? Yeah? Okay. I use this particular quote because it dovetails nicely with my second question. What roles do facilitators play in communities, and how have their strategies changed over the past 10 years? Again, I was speaking about my work in indigenous communities in southern highland Ecuador. And in this way, not just anybody can become a coyote. There's a certain set of body of knowledge that you would need to have, and a certain set of social networks that you would need access to. And I think I moved some of my pieces here. As my colleagues can attest, migrant facilitators are members of a social network. At the onset, they can be friends, colleagues, acquaintances, relatives, padrinos, which is a term where family members in the United States might be sending money back to finance the migration journey itself. This is a broad range of actors, transporters, hosts, communicators, and there's a certain reliance on trust, and I believe Gabriela will speak a little bit more about that as well. Coyotes, I'm going to switch back to coyotes, in some cases are migrants themselves who were unable to reach their destination, but after multiple attempts learned enough about the process to assist others. Coyotes are also constrained by a variety of factors that make fulfilling their contracted agreements too difficult or dangerous, often leaving migrants either stranded at a migration safe house and without reimbursing the money that they originally invested, and this is not their intention at the outset, I would say. Yatzil, also the contributor I mentioned earlier, conducted extensive research on these migrant safe houses and the alternative strategies people undertook in response to increased vigilance by migration authorities and gangs. So there's a convergence that's happening here. Indeed, there are many cases in which migrants were exploited, but we have to be very careful to understand that coyotes are also those folks who provide food and services that allow people to this safe passage or safer passage. In the case, I can speak about one example. I worked with, I collected testimonials of migrants here in the United States and also testimonials of migrants who had been deported back to Ecuador in the community where I worked. And one woman was telling me about a safe house that she had stayed at. She was indigenous. And when she, at the outset of her migration, she took off her pollera and put on jeans for the very first time in her life. And she said she felt naked. She didn't feel kind of part of who she was. And as she migrated, she saw that even within, and this is kind of speaks to the complexity, even within the migration process, she still felt marginalized because of her indigenous identity, even amongst the migrants who were moving themselves. And she stayed at a safe house in Guatemala and met the woman who was also indigenous and was helping her in the kitchen and said, you know, I am indigenous as well. And the woman gave her traditional clothing to put on. And so she felt kind of welcomed and accepted. And for me, this is a very symbolic moment of solidarity that is really beautiful in the way that it kind of continued when the Ecuadorian woman went through Mexico. She was robbed and was able to communicate with the woman who had hosted her, who sent her and wired her some money and gave her some more directions on how to continue on her journey. This is one story of many in which you see this kind of moments of solidarity. That woman would be considered part of this coyoterismo. And so I just want to kind of leave with her story and also this kind of notion that there's also kind of ethnicity is also a variable in these kinds of experiences. And I just want to speak very quickly, because I have a few more minutes, about the situation in Ecuador. And I spoke about policies in practice and policies that are not necessarily enforced. So we have, in the case of Ecuador, it has transformed over the years to become a country of transit. So it's not only a sending country that dates back, migration from Ecuador dates back to the 1960s, more or less. To today, we have many generations of Ecuadorians here in the United States. But more recently, since 2000, Ecuador has become what could be termed a country of transit. And as international migration flows through Ecuador and the region now include people from Iraq, Nigeria, Syria, Sudan, Zimbabwe, China, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Eritrea, and this is a long list, Kenya, Nepal, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Somalia, as well as migrants from Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. And inherent in that also is a long history of migration from Colombia and Peru. So why Ecuador, you may ask? In 2000, following an economic crisis, Ecuador converted to a dollarized economy, which has been one of the main attractions for migrants regionally, as favorable exchange rates allow them to maximize remittances that they send to family members. Migration from Colombia and Venezuela now is more of a refugee situation in terms of transcontinental migrants, Ecuador touts a free mobility platform, but in reality is decidedly less so. In terms of, it's under the Human Mobility Law, which was reissued in 2017. It's a step towards regularizing the situation of people on the move, including refugees, asylum seekers, stateless people, and victims of trafficking. The kind of basic principle is that everybody has the inherent right to move and seek better lives. And it's similar to the way that you would think no person is illegal. But this has brought about a large migration into Ecuador of people seeking a place to land and then begin their migration route along the migration corridor up through Central America and through Mexico. In reality, visa restrictions have been put into place for citizens of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Eritrea, Kenya, Nepal, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Somalia, and as well as for Cubans. So it's not entirely free in this case. This has been a very broad overview. 15 minutes is a very short time to really address these issues, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. By way of a very brief conclusion, as I know my colleagues will further contribute to the insight on this matter, fundamentally, despite increased migration control efforts, the market has not shut down. It allows and has allowed for the movement, arrival of Cuban, Venezuelan, Colombian migrants, and extracontinental arrivals. Migration policy directed towards stemming migration flows through increased patrols, detention, and prosecution will not stop migration because the compelling factors, which I briefly outlined again, will always be there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Let's turn now to Gabriela Sanchez and for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a bit closer. Is that perfect? Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I, just look around the room and I see so many familiar faces, and I get very excited, to be back in DC after being in for a while. So, first of all, thanks to Eric, to Duncan, to Chris, who, for hosting all of us, for welcoming us once again with this topic in a very special week. I'm sure that all of us have been following the news and are very much aware of the kind of intensity of the discourse that we're facing concerning the mobility of migrants. We, of course, want to also thank Tom, our editor from the Annals, for all of the work that he has carried out with us, putting together the special issue. And I also, of course, want to acknowledge the work, the incredible work of all of our collaborators. So if I can once again get a copy of do you have yeah. We just need, This collection is the result of the Luigi Achilli, who is currently at the University of California, San Diego, reached out to me about 2.5 years ago, and with an attempt to revamp, reignite a conversation that is not new. We have been talking about smuggling facilitation for decades. And there have been many voices that have questioned this dual narrative of the victim and the predator. But at the same time, this conversation many times, just comes and goes. It has experienced these kinds of flows that, in a sense, that it doesn't really go away. But then the conditions on the ground, the very violence and victimization that many migrants experience along their journeys, make us return to this idea that, wait, maybe the smugglers are what everybody, claims they are. So this collection was, again, an attempt from an empirical angle to try to expand on these ideas, try to make more sense of what we were witnessing on the ground, but at the same time comparing it globally. So the special issue has, once again, work from around the world. And today we took advantage of Eric's hospitality to bring you the chapters that were connected to the Latin American corridor. And of course, my computer had to. Right there. Okay. And what I am going to share with you today is, in part, material that draws from the very essence of the contributions that are related to the Latin American corridor. But it also tries to bring together Victoria's remarks and introduce some of the work that we have been carrying out along the U.S.-Mexico border that has to do with the diversity of smuggling facilitation. I think Victoria's presentation was very clear at kind of bringing about, erasing this question surrounding the very nature of smuggling. And we titled the very panel, looking beyond coyotes. And that is because some of the conditions that we're witnessing on the ground, and those of you who work with migrants, can attest to, does not always reflect, situations of exploitation or victimization, but rather a very clear push towards criminalization. So we will, today I'm going to try to give you, in a sense, a legal framework that can, at the same time, introduce some of the ideas that we mobilize as part of our articles in the special issue. So when we talk about smuggling, and this is something that Victoria has already mentioned, despite the visibility of smuggling as a practice, there's really not a lot when it comes to empirical research. Data is scattered. In fact, the United States is, to my knowledge, the only country in the world that is keeping track of federal convictions when it comes to smuggling. No other country, has been so effective, we want to call it, when it comes to keeping track of how many people are convicted at the federal level. And that number has been pretty steady. So for the last 4 or 5 years, it has been around 2,500 people, most of them U.S. citizens who live along the U.S.-Mexico border. The focus of most smuggling research has been on its criminal dimensions. And this is not only derived from, as Sheldon mentioned earlier, the policy demands, what law enforcement is also required to address. It's also based on a document that many of you must be familiar with, which is the protocol, on migrant smuggling and trafficking in persons, which was, who started, started in force. Do I have the date right there? Do I have the correct date? Oh, it actually went, I think, one. This is very effective. That's where I am. Which, once again, relies on the UNODC definition of smuggling of migrants, which is outlined in the protocol, and also the definition of organized crime, which establishes that organized crime should be an activity carried out by 3 or more people. So what are the limitations of relying on the protocol or mobilizing the notions that are present in the protocol? And these are realizations that the United Nations, UNODC, is pretty aware of. Now, looking back 15 years after the initial implementation of the protocol, where are we? Well, the fact that migrant smuggling is not always understood in accordance to the definition set out in the protocol, that many state parties to the protocol have failed to adopt, and this is key, a financial or material benefit clause as a requirement to the establishment of smuggling as a crime. And I am going to give you a couple of examples of how that actually gets mobilized on the ground. Cases like the provision of illegal entry for no financial motive nor material benefit, the provision of humanitarian assistance to escape conflict or persecution, or the attempts of migrants to carry out their own clandestine journeys are increasingly designated criminal offenses in multiple countries. So once again, we are trying to look at the entire corridor in the case of Latin America, but we see these trends taking place, being mobilized around the world. What are some of the implications, right, of designating smuggling the facilitation of ordinary assistance, of housing somebody in, of feeding somebody without receiving any kind of compensation, of smuggling or assisting with the facilitation or the mobility, or friends or family members for no compensation? Well, the main, and I guess the very first one is the fact that migrants' own attempts to seek protection are often criminalized through courts' interpretation of smuggling. We see a very clear increase in the numbers of cases that are being brought forth around the world and across Latin America concerning charges that are filed against those who provide assistance. People who, again, may welcome people in their homes, people who feed migrants as they travel, people who also provide care to those who become sick or injured during their journeys. This has important policy implications given the fact that the majority of those who are providing the services are women. Many of them are indigenous, and many of them are for very poor and marginalized countries. And of course, this enhances the risks for anybody who is in need of protection. Just a couple of examples from, again, from across Latin America. Oh, I'm following my, thank you for reminding me. So there's one example from Colombia. Diana is a Cuban migrant. She left Cuba and arrived in Colombia when she was, at the time that she was pregnant. She had a son, and at the time that she was about to deliver, 2 women provided her with housing. So they welcomed her into her home. The police came by and claimed that they were being traficantes, or, in this case, and this is also going back to terminology. The way trafficking and smuggling, often are used interchangeably. So the 2 women who provided her with assistance were placed on house arrest and formally charged with migrant smuggling. And this is, and the key, one of the key statements that were connected to this case was once again the fact that the women were providing assistance without looking for any kind of compensation. And on this picture right here, I decided I wasn't perhaps not very effective at blurring the face in a more aesthetic way. But I think the picture is very clear at showing at the same time the kind of spectacle that filing charges against people for smuggling has become. So this is a case from Nicaragua. A local school teacher who also assisted a family with housing and with room and board. And the kinds of cases that are often brought forward even without any kind of evidence. So in this case, as we see here, police did not present any kind of evidence that could support the claim that a local professor was a migrant smuggler. The legal advisor to the Human Rights Commission stated that the provision of help must not be labeled a crime. Our legislation instead states that citizens must provide help to those whose lives are at risk. So what we see here, once again, is this interpretation that does not fall in line with what is outlined in the protocol when it comes to with the provision of help. I'm trying to fly through the slides so that we can have more time for conversation and discussion. But of course, we also need to talk about the U.S. case, because this is the destination of many of these migrants is ultimately the United States. In one of the cases that I believe has generated a lot of concern among advocates, in the country, has been the potential for parents to face smuggling charges for facilitating the transit or the travel of their kids. So this has in part been part of criminal law for many years. So the very practice of filing charges about those who facilitated or who supported smuggling or clandestine journeys was already in the books. But however, last year, starting in the summer of 2017, there was a search initiative in the United States that focused on the identification and arrest of individuals that were labeled as involved in illicit human smuggling. And the target was, again, the quote-unquote sponsors. And most of those who are facilitating or who are paying the fees that are connected with the journeys of migrants are friends and family members. So many of these arrests actually involve parents of the children who had traveled or who had entered the country, like in the case of Noemi, which was, I'll be very glad to share more details about. But again, this notion of who becomes a sponsor of smugglers or who contributes financially to a criminal operation has been used or has been mobilized to further criminalize families. And what we see in examples of this nature or in attempts of this nature is the fact that the disrupt and dismantle strategy really does nothing at attacking, or countering the very reasons that are behind the mobility of people, first of all, and does little at dismantling the so-called transnational networks. What this in fact does is that it pushes activities of the facilitators, further underground. It increases the risks for children and their families. So when you are not allowed to travel through a specific route, and this is something that many scholars have already covered, facilitators opt for more hidden mechanisms that put at risk the lives of the people. Imagine, and these risks compound given the fact that we're talking about children. Okay. So I think the 3 points that I want for all of us to reflect on as we move to the third presentation, the third and concluding presentation for the panel, is the fact that we are dealing not with the fear of the smuggler when it comes to the criminalization or when we are talking about the filing of charges at the legal level. We are dealing with the criminalization of friends, family members, relatives, indigenous people, poor women, the marginalized. So it is, as much as it is part of our mission, I guess, to improve the way in which we are documenting the facilitation of these journeys, our goal is also to generate greater awareness over the limitations of legislation, of how protocols may be at many times or come short at defining or limited when it comes to defining who should be labeled a smuggler. So in this sense, we are bringing about the concerns over how these legal gaps are creating room that is leading to the criminalization of solidarity at a greater level. And in that sense, what I would like to leave all of you with is, how can we move this conversation towards, once again, one that tries to rethink the ways in which we think about the smuggler, as a predator, and try to not ask, once again, what's the profile of the smuggler, but rather who is being prosecuted and who is being forward to court when it comes to many of these legal processes. Thank you.
Sheldon?
Yes.
If you want to go to the right, there you go. It's at 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock? Yeah.
That's the one that will advance.
All right. Okay, well, I'm back again. What I want to present is a paper that Gabriela and I worked on together, but I want you to know Gabriela did most of the work. I'm just here taking all the credit. What got this project started was that both of us have encountered stories and reports about the convergence of two markets, human smuggling and drug trafficking. And we've also heard stories from multiple sources about undocumented migrants were asked to carry backpacks across the border or pay a fine, and all sorts of stories that suggested that, whether the drug trafficking organizations, the DTOs, were taking over the smuggling routes along the Mexico and U.S. border. Of course, at that time, we understand that what we call the big gun theory is that the drug traffickers have more guns, and as opposed to the human smuggler, the coyotes. And of course, when the two groups collide or come in contact with each other, inevitably those who have bigger guns will win the battle. So the theory was the drug traffickers, the DTOs, are taking over all the routes that lead into the U.S. Just to let you know, it's actually fairly difficult to conduct field work and trying to gain access to the population who have knowledges of both. We've had a lot of conversations in the field, informal conversations with the community contacts and our contacts. You can't really get that stories from people who only know about smuggling or people who only know things about drug trafficking. You have to find people who know both. So when we wound up for this study, is that Gabriela found 28 migrants who had knowledge of both worlds. So, and that was, in terms of empirical work, was really unusual and difficult to achieve. So again, lots of informations, a lot of informal conversations, and then we had in-depth interviews with the 28 migrants from Central America and Mexico. And the interview sites include Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. So, get to the bottom of the findings. I know you have a lot of questions. You may want to start a conversation with us. What we have found is that it's neither. I mean, our theory is to start with this project, when we started this project, we had a theory as to whether these two markets are converging, become overlapped, that the smugglers, the human smugglers, the coyotes, are getting involved in drug trafficking and vice versa, and drug traffickers are also becoming involved in human smuggling. So they have two markets emerging, or that the drug trafficker just directly take over the markets and control all the routes that go into U.S. We found neither. What we have found is that a tremendous increase or proliferation of actors with little or no criminal intent to operate along the migrant routes. So what we found is really the flattening of the criminal markets along the migrant routes. The physical routes are still there, but the market space has been flattened or democratized. And you have a tremendous increase of actors moving into a rather crowded environment. And this was really in direct response to the increased control regime, the law enforcement, the border hardening, where you have limited opportunities or limited market space and tremendous increase in the actors. Now, the problem with all this is really because of the mobility inducement, what we call it, the increase of awareness when more and more people becoming aware of their plight, the inequality, and the struggle to achieve some sort of a mobility. And we all know mobility leads to opportunities. However, the opportunities are restricted or limited, or path to the mobility are limited. And therefore, you have more people crowding into a market space, and not because traditional DTOs are controlling the market space, but because the overcrowding of the market space. And what we found is that the migrants is really, there's a little evidence to suggest that there's a fear of either cartels or the traffickers taking over the market, or the migrant smugglers, the coyotes, and the traffickers collaborating and forging alliances. But really, what we found is a tremendous amount of exercise in agency, in promoting self-interest. And along the way, collaboration, cooperation happened. And then people interacted with each other, and people were actually engaged in mutual aid to pull together resources and to accomplish shared goals. The problem really lies, I'm a sociologist, the problem really lies in the persistent demand, the increased awareness of inequality and the increased awareness of the significance in mobility. And mobility leads to opportunity, which leads to improved economic situation. So the demand for smuggling services remains there. And however, the market space remains limited or restricted. So as more people flood into that market space, of course, they come into contact with each other. And what we have is a market space where people come with whatever resources they have, and then they go into either a form of mutual aid or collaboration or cooperation, and in the pursuit of their own self-interest. And if that's the case, then the traditional targeted interventions from law enforcement perspectives becomes less potent. Now, I want to come here. I don't want you to think I'm the last speaker here before Luis. I don't want you to come here. We're a bunch of heart-bleeding liberals here and trying to argue that tear down that wall and nothing's going to happen. Well, the problem will be resolved. I'm trying to here to make myself useful here and telling those of you who are from Homeland Securities or ICE, there's some information might be useful to you. The traditional law enforcement strategies that are targeting specific drug trafficking organizations or human smuggling organizations is not going to be very effective because essentially what you're facing is a market space full of individual actors who find ways to collaborate with each other. So whether you want to militarize the border, whether you want to build a wall, such a targeted enforcement most likely is not going to be very effective. And as a Chinese, I can tell you the story that more than 2,000 years ago, we tried. We built a wall. And as you can tell, the effect of that wall. However, it does make a great tourism attraction. For those of you who go to China, you inevitably want to see that wall. For those of you who've been to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, in that barren deserts, we probably could use a good tourism attraction down there too. So in 2,000 years from now, I bet there will be a good tourism attraction down in that part of the world also. What I'm trying to argue here is it's really impossible to achieve any measurable impact if you were to do such a large-scale targeted intervention, because the market space is occupied mostly by individual players. Now, if you really want to push us to say, what is it we can find something that's useful to those of you who are working at Homeland Security or CBP, I can tell you the only thing probably useful is probably go through some market disruption strategies. You know, disrupt the markets and do randomized interventions, and then you probably will see some measurable impact instead of building a wall, but that's the end of our story.
Thank you.
Rick, is that good?
Yeah. All right. Let's hear from Louise, who's a well-known international expert on transnational organized crime, been here many occasions. We'll open it up for questions with you all. I know I already have several, so
Okay.
Go ahead, Louise.
So Eric talked about how I was in residence here over 30 years ago. And when I started working on these issues of transnational crime, it was called a marginal problem, literally. And I don't think anyone would say that it's a marginal problem today. In fact, the problem is now a politicized problem rather than an issue that I thought needed attention, because I was focusing in my early days not so much on human smuggling, but on the growing problem of human trafficking. And I think we need to talk a little bit more about that, because sometimes human smuggling does turn into human trafficking. And to ignore that problem is to do an injustice to the victims of human trafficking. We do not have enough research on the social context in which this mass human migration is going on. And this study is really, or this studies we've had, or this volume, is very, very important in understanding this. And in a new book that I have completed that's coming out called Dark Commerce, I talk about how a lot of people view human smugglers as being service providers. They don't see them as criminals. And I think this provides a richness of data and understanding that has not previously been available in the literature. And so it's very, very important, and it provides a historical, cultural, political context. Last week I was testifying with some law enforcement and former law enforcement on the opioid epidemic. And the law enforcement was making the point that law enforcement is not going to resolve this problem. And I think the same thing is the point that you're making. This has such deep roots, there's such human motivation to it, that this is not something where disruption and arrest is the way to deal with these issues of public policy and how do we deal with illicit migration. I will point out that there's another way to do this research that gives you a slightly different view of this problem of where there is what I would call the criminalization of the migrant smuggler. And it's really, really important to have this on-the-ground data, sort of anthropological immersion in the networks and understanding how it works as a human phenomenon. But there's also a very different view that you get when you look at following the money and you look at some of the large-scale data analysis. And I think if you look at those two together, you come up with a picture that helps you understand this even better. And it's very important to have an understanding of these sort of local, sort of hopeful networks, which will not show up in what happens when you look at the large-scale data analysis. For example, at one point I was talking to the former Attorney General of the state of Arizona, who was very interested. He subsequently lost in a backlash, but he was following the money in Arizona. And at the end of when the financial crisis started in 2007, there was a lot of movement of cash into properties that were gone, where the owners could no longer afford to pay the mortgages. And so there was indications that there was drug money that was moving into safe houses, some of that might be used and helping smugglers. And so the question comes, that's where you begin to look more at the intersection of these phenomena, by looking at money flows rather than individuals who are low down and are not seeing much of these illicit relationships. Recently, I was talking in preparation for something else I was testifying on human trafficking networks and how you can mine large-scale financial data to find human trafficking networks, which are not smuggling networks. These are individuals who often, after they've been moved into the United States, become victims of sexual and labor exploitation. And when you look at this data, which is totally different from what you're describing, not because it's on the ground, but also because there are key nodes and key individuals in it, you find something that's very different. And in some of their preliminary research of the people who are doing some of the best algorithms on these routes that are going from El Paso north, you were finding convergence of some of the drug and the human trafficking networks. Not smuggling, but trafficking networks. So the question comes, as we're talking about what are we pursuing as a strategy in this area, is that human smuggling, which you're defining as basically a socially based and not that often a coercion or extortion-based network, turns in, and how to prevent it from turning into human trafficking, which is one of the more exploitative human relationships that I know about, that involves enslavement, that involves enormous violence. And we have, along the whole Northeast corridor, Hispanic brothels of women who are often smuggled and then forced into trafficking. And you can see these networks through financial indicators. As was done a few years ago, law enforcement was finding these networks by looking at the highway tolls as these women were moved every Sunday to new brothels. Yes, so that they would never have an opportunity of bonding with their clients who might then rescue them, as happened in a case of young trafficked girls from Veracruz in Florida. So there are ways, by using and combining insights, to get at what is the really serious problem of trafficking and criminal exploitation. And the insights that come from your research should help us understand and contextualize. So the point that Gabriela is making is that people are not doing this, that there are people not doing this for money. If you focus on following the money, and especially the large financial flows of repeat activity, that's where you find the traffickers. And that's where we need to be focusing our efforts, on the individuals who are really engaged in exploiting individuals and differentiating out the problems of migrant smuggling, which is often done, as you're saying, in a human, compassionate sense of individuals where it's family unification, or individuals that could go and legitimately apply for asylum status. And therefore, it's not as if the problems don't exist, because when you mine the data, you actually find that these problems exist. But they're not, but there's a whole other phenomenon that has been, as Sheldon talked about, democratized, in which you have large numbers of actors. And that's something that's very interesting in looking at this in a comparative perspective, because Europol, the European police body, in looking at what has happened in the last few years in Europe, has talked about the enormous rise of organized crime networks. What is this? These are these small groups of thousands and thousands of people who've gone to facilitate human smuggling, which falls under the definition of, 3 people involved. But it is also, as you would talk about it, a democratization of the markets is going on in Europe, as well as going on in the United States, and that it's very small scale and many, many more people participating. And it's this movement that we need to think about much more carefully of what is serious organized crime, and that is a very potent form of instability, financial resources to the state, and what is the democratization of large-scale human smuggling. And only by understanding the patterns that you're describing, when you look at some of the data from another point of view, do you get the insights that you need to see what you're seeing in the data analysis. And since there's much more going on in data analysis and supply chains, you need this human element to understand what the phenomenon is and how it works. And that way you can make sure that the people who are socially motivated and not involved in exploitation, like the teachers, like in the descriptions that you have in the articles of the roles of civil society, providing safe houses in the passage, are not the criminals who are providing safe houses that they've bought, in distressed markets. And therefore, we need the two, and we haven't had the other to put much of what we're talking about in context, and to understand where we're talking about transnational organized crime, which is one phenomenon, and where we're talking about, small-scale democratization of migrant smuggling. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Let's give everybody a round of applause. Before I open it up to everybody in the audience, I wanted to give you all a chance to respond if you want, comment on what Louise has said, make any additional points. I have a question too. I think we're doing well on time. We'll get you out of here on time, but go ahead if you have anything. If you want to say anything.
Thank you so much for all the comments, and I'm actually kind of excited, not excited, I am excited that you are here thinking, I haven't seen you for so many years, so thank you once again to all of you for being here. I think that there's many ways of studying, phenomena, ways to bring about different practices. Our work, we are very fortunate of the fact that we have developed what is now a strong relationship with UNODC in Vienna. So we are part of a team that, when this effort first came up, we would just used to think, do you think they will ever listen to us? Do you think that they will ever bring us into the conversation when we are only talking about case studies, things that are happening here and there, when they actually have access to this wealth, to these large bodies of data. Luigi and I would love for Luigi to be here, and he will be so excited. And the answer is that now we are, as a team, as a collective of researchers who are doing empirical work on smuggling, being invited to the table and to contribute with this kind of information. And that is precisely because our data can provide very important insights to all of these other bodies of data that are out there. I think, and this is a comment that I made in Vienna last week at the plenary, the UNODC, the fact that we have never had so much data. Everybody has data. And once again, when it comes to the issue of human trafficking, just as we do with human smuggling, it's a hyper-visible and hyper-political topic. So of course there's going to be the push towards mobilizing some of the most tragic, most visible, most graphic of the cases. And here, once again, we are not claiming that violence does not exist, that exploitation doesn't take place. What we're seeing, what we're trying to call here, in fact, is for a push toward, again, a more empirical, driven angle that tries to stay away from the cases that do receive, most of the attention, and to understand the everyday practices that nobody takes a look at. The ones that take, that once again, the ones that many of us probably are familiar with in our work with migrants at churches, at, through some of the agencies, law enforcement, having been based, I know perfectly the case you were talking about, because before entering academia, I was in law enforcement. I was a criminal investigator in Maricopa County, when they're the very same time when this dam warrants were actually issued. Dam warrants were was part of a program that the Attorney General put into place, trying to deter the actions of migrant smugglers, saying that any kind of wire transfer that exceeded the amount of $600 had to be labeled as one that was coming from a smuggling operation. For those of us who have migrant families or who at some point have had to rely on Western Union or any of those services to wire money, you would know that $600 is really not that much. So many of these restrictions that were placed on the wire transfers actually affected families that had no connection to organized crime, who had never had to deal at all with human smuggling or drug trafficking. Now, I am not saying that that was probably effective at some level, but once again, what we are
talking about.
Oh, no, but that is one of the cases that I am familiar with. So that's the one that I'm bringing up, and so, but this is again, and I am not saying that, and I am definitely not saying that what you are saying is wrong. It's once again that this is showing how diverse, the kind of diverse opinions that we have and how contested the field is. More than, because I think, and this was also part of the conversation that we had in Vienna last week, this is where we're stuck. This is precisely where we are, trying to define, are we going to fight the fight against, modern day slavery? Or do we have to go rescue all the migrants? And I think that has been a conversation that has made us all, feel pretty stuck. Because we can have, once again, entire bodies of data, but unless we learn to have new conversations, as you mentioned, if we don't learn how to reinterpret the data in ways that are inclusive and that also acknowledge the realities that law enforcement, migrants, are also facing on the ground, we are pretty stuck. And I think that most of us here on the panel will be, and many of the people here in the room will acknowledge the fact that these are conversations that are not new. So once again, where do we move them to? And how can we do, once again, to work together when it comes to this?
I just want to say that any sort of person who understood human smuggling would know that that $600 is not a type of bar that you should put on this. That's why you need research. There was a geographic targeting order in New York that was $3,000. And then the question was, how often did the same people be sending this amount of money, that began to look at where the drug transfers were going, not the human smuggling. But the issue comes is if you are, as we've had cases, and there are Hispanic brothels in which one, illicit activity is hidden within another, and where hundreds of women are moved along the Northeast Corridor along highways each week from Maine to farther south, and they're tolls, and that's how you can begin to look at this exploitation that's going on of the vulnerable. That's what you need to look at, not at things that are affecting not smugglers, but that are affecting people who've been smuggled and their ability to repatriate money. One has to begin to look at what are the financial targets, like $3,000, that if you're sending $3,000 each week, that's not possible for an individual to be repatriating to his country themselves from what they're earning. So you need much more sophisticated economic analysis that chases this out and does not stigmatize individuals. But it is also a way of looking at where, like these highway tolls or other things that are going on that are just absolute footprints of trafficking. And the footprint of trafficking is very, very different from the footprint of smuggling.
Thank you. I guess that's what we try to do here at the Wilson Center, is open up space for a little more detailed and deeper dive into these very complex issues. And I want to congratulate all of you, not me, I didn't do anything, all of you for your incredible work and reminding us of the complexity of these various phenomenon. I wanted to ask a question too, and sorry to bring it back to something so specific, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the U.S.-Mexico border, because that seems to be the focus of a lot of attention. Obviously, the Mexican-Guatemalan border is also of interest, but for the moment, I'd like to talk about the U.S.-Mexico border. And here's the situation. I think there's a narrative, and I've actually been there a lot and sort of observed it, that border has become incredibly difficult to traverse for anybody. And that part of that is actions on the part of the U.S. government to thicken, to make it more complex and difficult to get across. And my impression, based on interviews with migrants, is that at least those at the border, their experience along the way may be one thing, you know, the good-willed teacher in Nicaragua, or even I've seen this in southern Mexico, but at the border, the complexity of getting across is so difficult that it's more and more improbable that just, you know, anybody can dash across the border, right? I think DHS has actually done analysis of the effectiveness of border agents in preventing people from getting across, and by their own analysis, it's somewhere in, if I'm remembering correctly, in the neighborhood of 60 and 80% effectiveness. Now, it's a broad range, but nevertheless, it gives you an impression that they're increasingly good at what they do. And I suspect, even though I don't know that the wall will, quote-unquote, solve the problem, it's going to affect how people try to enter into the United States, making it more complicated. My impression is, in the complexity of that terrain along the border, people have had to rely more and more on criminal actors. Not just the good-willed coyote or pollero that says, you know, there's the U.S., ándale pues, you know, it's more difficult. Border Patrol agents talk about the incredible intelligence that criminal actors have, understanding where there are weaknesses. They can move people from point A to point B depending on their own intelligence gathering. So the nexus between migrants who are trying to enter into the United States and criminal organizations seems to me to be pretty estrecho, as they say, pretty tight on that border. And so, and that's where it's not clear to me that there's such specialized services either. You know, Group A only does humans and Group B only does drugs. Those are the questions that I have, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, any impressions from your own your own research on that front. Is that narrative incorrect? Am I missing something here?
I think, Eric, it's a very correct narrative, because the more that you make things difficult, the more that you facilitate the entry of organized crime. I call them illicit entrepreneurs. And that's where you have much more of a business coming in. And the issue comes is in this dialogue is, how do you make sure that smuggling does not become trafficking in which you have criminal organizations? And that's a very central question that we need to be thinking about. But we definitely, from what I can see in my analysis, that we are having a transformation. As you make things more difficult, you need much more sophistication to cross a border.
Yeah, I felt like, people say the wall will do nothing. Well, I'm not so sure it will do nothing. It may not do what policymakers in the United States think it will do. It's not going to solve a problem, but it's going to affect this whole business model.
I think
If
it'll
it
lead
is-
to more tunnels.
Well, it may go more tunnels. They might,
But
they may-
entrepreneurship.
They may use drones to get people. I don't know, but
Yes.
it's going to shift how things happen. I don't know.
But
Sheldon.
these businesses, I'll just say, the whole thing of criminal entrepreneurship, of illicit entrepreneurship, is that it's always changing. So no matter whatever you do, it changes in response to everything else. So it doesn't matter if it's a wall, if you send more people on the border, whatever happens, it shifts.
And I'm not always, and I think here's where you guys have talked about this too. Some of that criminal enterprise we then associate with, severe violence and on all these things. I'm not sure that that's always the case. They're providing a service that's, outside of the law, clearly, but, I'm not sure that that's always 100% exploitative, that sometimes they even provide two for the price of one services and that kind of thing. So anyway, I'll shut up, and I'd love to hear what Sheldon and Gabriella and Victoria have to say.
Thank you, Eric. I just wanted, I think we have actually tremendous amount of agreement in what we describe this thing. I think it's a matter of framing it, how we perceive it. The original intent of the whole issue, this special issue in the annals, is really try to counter this dichotomous view of either you're ruthless criminal gangs or you are the victims, the vulnerable victims being taken advantage of. In reality, it's neither. What we have found is, yes, we agree with you, with the target hardening or the border hardening, it becomes more and more difficult. Whereas back in the 80s and 90s, remember, Louis and I were doing our research in diapers, so we were still 10 or 15 years old back then. You could essentially dash across the border.
Right.
You relied very little of any professional or specialized help.
Right.
You could just rely on your own guts and courage.
Or a low-priced
risk
coyote.
Low-priced coyotes, and anybody who knows a little thing about it, you can cross over. And back in the 90s, if you're looking into the smuggling routes, there's a very little collaboration or overlapping between the drug traffickers and the human smugglers. They were essentially minding their own business and doing their own things. Now with the target hardening or border hardening, you essentially forced these two groups of people into the same market space now.
Right.
And they started collaborating with each other. They brought with them with the resources. Of course, being entrepreneurial, they take advantage, whether you call it intelligence, whether you call it a specialties, or essentially it's a merchandise, it's a service where they can sell. So that's what I'm arguing here is that they're really all pursuing their own self-interest, whether you want to cross border or whether you want to sell your merchandise or intelligence for a fee. The intents or the intentions are quite similar. And it's just but as the market space, it becomes very tight now. And you force a lot of people who would otherwise not come into contact with each other now have to work with each other and pull their resources together, either to peddle it or to take advantage of or use it. Along the way, of course, violence does occur, exploitation does occur.
Sure.
But the vast majority of the actors there were essentially pursuing self-interest, either want to get across the border or want to sell a service and to make some money. So what we see is the shrinking market space and greater contact with different kinds of players. And what we fail to see, or we are unable to substantiate, is any group dominating this market space.
Can I also say something? That back in the 90s, when I was teaching every year in Mexico, Mexico was very different than it is today. And what we've had in recent decades has been the enormous rise of powerful organized crime that has much greater control over territory than it did when we were looking at these phenomena. So we're looking at a very significant political transformation in Mexico that also has affected the situation.
Exactly. I don't know how many, maybe I'm too old for this, but maybe, did people remember an old movie called El Norte? A wonderful story of a Guatemalan caciquel, I think, who fled Guatemala and then came into the United States. And her crossing the border was through a sewer pipe, which was horrible, and she got typhoid fever and all that stuff, but nothing like what we see today. I mean, it's really obvious that it's changed dramatically. So anyway, we've all had a lot to say. You guys look like you have a lot of questions. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, waiting for the microphone so that folks online can hear your question, that'd be great. Right here, our good friend. You have a lot. No, but this is for recording. How are you? Good to see you. Can you tell us your name?
Sure. So thank you for doing, is this on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for doing this. This is Maria Peña. I am the Washington correspondent for La Opinión and Imprimedia. So thank you for doing this wonderful and timely panel. I wanted to see if you could address specifically the new arguments, the new old arguments that the Trump administration is using to justify deploying the National Guard at the border. I remember from the Obama administration, they kept saying the border has never been more secure. And when you look at the data, it's still the case that it's never been more secure by the number of agents, the technology, et cetera. So can you address what is the president basing his arguments on to justify deploying the National Guard this time around? Is it because of we have a similar situation from what the Bush administration did or what the Obama administration did? Can you address that specifically?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I'll take two more. Sir, you're okay. Wait, Jimmy, and then we'll come back here because Jimmy, introduce yourself.
Very briefly, Jimmy McDonough from the Buffett Foundation. I'm wondering, there's been a lot of material written about the protection money that smugglers have to pay to cartels during the transit in Mexico. So I'm wondering about how that fits into your analysis.
Good. And we have a question, last question for the first round. We'll come back over here. Tom? Thank you for your work on this publication.
And thanks for doing this. So what I'm struggling with here is balancing sort of social justice issues and interests that surface readily if you read through the material that we published and that we pursued in this volume, and reasonable and justifiable sort of national security and sovereignty interests that governments approach this with. So I came into this session this morning kind of with a general disposition that it's no surprise to hear of the relative impotence of or counterproductivity of policies when it comes to deterring the activities that they seek to contain, that it's no surprise that it's likely a big mistake for states to regard migration as an activity that should be approached principally as suspect for its potential criminality, and it shouldn't be a surprise for those of us who know the literature a little bit, and I'm not an expert, that by and large migration isn't the cause of social ills for receiving countries, right? So what I'm trying to do is balance the social justice interests of those of us who want to see a more humane approach to treating migration flows with balancing that with national security and sort of sovereignty interests. So I think, Louise, you helped me a great deal by trying to help me sort of separate out these different aspects of migration and the separation of human trafficking and human smuggling. but I need a sense of scale here. I really have no idea. Eric, maybe you know. I just don't have any idea of a sense of scale when you think of migration flows which ebb and flow constantly, which rise and fall greatly year to year, decade to decade. How much of the normal migration flow in and out of the United States is criminally predominant? You know what I mean?
Okay, 3 good questions, and you all can answer as you feel fit. Take in any one or invent another question if you like, but
Thank you.
all right, I'm going to call on Gabriela.
Oh, God. Here I am trying to say, like, no, you go. Thank you once again for the questions. I personally, I can talk about smuggling for days. I wouldn't get tired of it. But I'm going to try to go through some of the more pressing questions, because I also get the sense that the conversation went towards, again, the very dichotomy that we wanted to try to stay away from. Again, in between, is there good smugglers, or are they bad? Are they good, or should we lock them up? Are they traffickers? Are they smugglers? And again, I think part of the goal of the special issue was to begin to disturb that narrative, and not to stay again on those two points, which I think once again that are not very productive in that sense. I tweet a lot, and last night I actually tweeted back to Twitter saying, by the way, you guys, have you seen the numbers that are available through the online, the statistics that look at apprehensions, along the Southwest? We are pretty much at the same levels as the 1970s, and that's something that all of us, I think most of the people in the room should know. So people are not coming. Or people along the border are being, their levels of apprehensions are at that level. And something that David Danello, who's also here joining us in the room today, pointed during a presentation that he had not too long ago in Brussels, was the fact that we have very low apprehensions and record highs when it comes to the numbers of agents, within the agency. So that is just one point to keep in mind. And I'm sure that my co-panelists can expand on that notion. When it comes to the payment of piso or bribes, or how much of that money goes into the fees, one of our collaborators, by the fact, shared with me a story that I think was very telling, that she was, just talking to some smuggling facilitators. And in this case, most of the work that we have been able to document talks about the pay-as-you-go strategy. Migrants were only able to pay so far so much, a segment of their journey. So that all-inclusive package that, or the single format, the monolithic version of the smuggler is pretty much inaccessible for most of those who travel. So we're talking about very, I don't want to use the word necessarily vulnerable, but the migrants who lack access to the most basic levels of protection. So when our collaborator was talking to one of these facilitators, he was saying, so this is my fee. He drew a circle on the ground. I'm like, this is my part. That was a third. This is the part that I pay to those who help me. Who's what, maybe another 10%. The rest goes to bribes. And when he was asked, well, who do you pay the bribes to? He's like, well, to the police. As we cross through Mexico, yes, there's piso that is requested by, requested is a very nice word, that is demanded, as we go through areas that are under control of drug trafficking organizations. And the elephant in the room, that is, something that has hardly ever been the subject of any kind of research, corruption along the U.S.-Mexico border. So all of those fees, imagine, that if your fee was, and this is a very low fee to say, if you're paying $250 to cover a segment, 70% of that going to somebody else, what does that leave you as a smuggler, as a smuggling facilitator? How many clients are you bringing in? Those numbers, and this is something that I love about the numbers from the U.S. Sentencing Commission. The majority of the cases that are brought forward when it comes to federal convictions on smuggling are for very small scale operations. So that's 1, 2, 3 migrants. So those massive arrests that you get to see hardly ever, come forward, or hardly ever investigated. So those are, already two things to keep in mind. That perhaps the obsession with numbers that we see are, a very hard reflection of what we hear about. It's a very hard notion for a smuggler. And I think, again, that drawing was very clear in the sense, like, everything is going away. I'm really not making a lot of money. That is actually forcing them more, and this is something that I have written elsewhere. It's forcing out the more, the facilitators with more expertise out of a market, because they are seeing their share, of income going down. So why am I going to stay in a market that I cannot make any money at? I should just, abro una tiendita, I open up a little store and I make a little bit of money that way, and I don't have to put up with all of these lovely people who are taking away all my money. So, but I'll shut up. And I'll leave it here.
Anybody else
I
want
can
to
talk about it
contribute?
forever.
Just going back to the issues of whether we should, again, back to the framing issue, I think it's more really about a crowded market space. And as you tighten up the border, restricting the physical routes to travel, you force people to purchase services, whereas previously people could spend very little. And this is really nothing new. It really depends on the kind of resources or networks you have. Whether such resources are available as part of your social network. Back in the 90s, when Mexicans or Central Americans spent very little money to cross the border, usually about $500 or $600 back then in the 90s, the Chinese migrants had to spend 10 times as much to cross the border. Why? Because they had no other resources. They didn't know better. So as you force the market space, as you tighten in the market space, even the Mexicans or Central Americans have to now resort to the so-called professional smugglers. Whether you call them criminals, whether you want to criminalize them or pathologize them or not, essentially these are business people, and they just have some resources to peddle off. That's my take on this.
One comment that I didn't make earlier, and thank goodness Gabriella brought it up, is the centrality of corruption to this issue.
Right.
And that's a problem everywhere along the route. It's a problem on our border. It's more a problem on the southern side of the border, but it's also a problem on the northern side of the border. Back when I first started working on this problem decades ago, there was limited corruption in our border service. This is not the case today. And so this corruption is also a very corrosive issue for societies. And that's something that it's not just corrosive for human beings who are forced to pay it, but it's corrosive as it undermines governance and rule of law.
I could take a couple more questions. Chris Wilson, I thought there was one in the back there. Did you change your mind? Over here, one. All right, make them short, please, so we can get 3 more in.
I'll try and be quick. I have somewhat of a 2-part question. So one is related to the targeting of the parents in the U.S. And last summer, and wondering if you see any distinction, because many of the parents were targeted for detention and deportation, but very, very few of them were actually charged with smuggling, and if that actually matters. And then what do you see as sort of the degree of independence of these independent actors, and whether things like that and the criminalization of, the example of the teacher and then the 2 folks that helped the pregnant woman has on other folks acting as independent actors? Are they afraid of being criminalized, and does that therefore push migrants into some of these larger criminal networks because you see independent actors being afraid to act as independent actors?
Okay, good question. Up back here. And I want to come around to Chris, and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, thank you very much. The public media and also the conversation today, probably deservedly, has been very focused on informal migration through the land border. And I just wanted to ask what, if any, role the more formal migration process serves, using fraudulent information to get a visa, going in that way, and going in at other points of entry, whether the hardening of the border has any impact on that, and whether it differs for the smuggling rings we've been talking about and the trafficking rings on the other side. Thank you.
Good. Chris?
Thanks very much. Thank you to all for the presentation. I'm Chris Wilson with the Mexico Institute here. This is mainly for Gabriela, but anyone else who wants to jump in on it as well. I sort of want to just confirm what I think I'm hearing from you, which is that your model or sort of view on how the dynamics of migration and migrant smuggling have changed is that there's, in response to a hardening border and maybe lots of other factors, there's more peso payments being made, and that those are going to organized crime and lots of other actors. But that's the sort of the evolution, is not the convergence of criminal organizations and migrant smuggling organizations, TCOs and migrant smuggling organizations, but rather greater payments of peso going to them and others. And I guess maybe the sort of a different way of asking the question is, you guys stated that, that there are lots of different ways in which collaboration and spaces overlap. What are those, what are some of the specifics of the ways in which you see TCOs operating in this space as they overlap into this space?
All right. Thank you. Looks like you're on the hook again here, Gabriela. You can chime in too, Victoria.
I guess both Gabriela and I mentioned the case of Noemi earlier, and we didn't really expand very much on terms of parents. This goes to some of the question, but I think that it's an important case to understand. Noemi was a young indigenous girl who's about 12 or 13 years old from the southern region of Ecuador in Tambo, which is where I had conducted my fieldwork. And a number of years after I came back to the United States, this kind of came to the media about 3 or 4 years ago, this young girl who was detained in Mexico in a safe house, and she ended up being interrogated by immigration officials there, and shortly thereafter committed suicide in a bathroom because of a variety of reasons. Nobody would really ever know the ultimate causes. And as this case investigation unfolded, one of the the situation was her parents had gone to the United States in early 2000. There was a large wave of migration from Ecuador to the U.S., and they settled in New York City. They had more children, and they wanted to bring their children with them. They wanted to reunify their family. This is what we were talking about. The clandestine family reunification is really one of the bigger demographics, I think, of migration currently. And they contracted a coyote. And the cost for this, I think more so in the case of Ecuador, and perhaps, that would be an interesting question in terms of these piecemeal kind of payments. In the case of Ecuador, the cost of migration is about $12,000 to $15,000. That's the debt that people will take. And there's coyotes and there's money lenders, which are different. These are different kinds of players. And the money lenders, we talk about class and race in Ecuador, they are kind of a different constituency. They use fear. They often use fear to get the money back and so forth. So the family made, I'm going to go all over the place with this, but you can rein me back in. The family paid the $2,000 to $3,000 initial down payment so that they could bring their daughter. And in this contract, there was multiple attempts included in the contract. So they could this is also one of the contracts that you can make, that you will either pay one fee and a small fee to get from one place to the next, or if you're doing a kind of leg of the trip, you can pay for a certain number of attempts to get across a border. So they had paid a coyote to bring their daughter a number of times until she was successful. The first time she was detained, she was held in Honduras, I believe, and then sent back to Ecuador, and the parents wanted her to try again. And the second attempt, she came to the United States, or she came and was detained in Mexico. The case unfolded that they believe that she was sexually abused on the route. unbeknownst to her parents. And when she was, her remains were sent back to Tambo, her parents were unable to attend the funeral in itself, but they were visited by, I believe, President Obama. Yeah, and kind of in their grief, their moment of grief. So this is one kind of story that speaks about this families trying to reunify across the border. They were not detained, even though that people knew that they were in a irregular status, because they were kind of in these spotlights about this one particular situation. And in terms of the detainment of parents in the United States, or in the last few years, I'm going to let Gabriela speak a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to kind of give a space for her story. Again, this is, and it does speak to, there are moments of vulnerability and extreme exploitation that do happen. We see some specialization of coyotes who are working with children because of this, that people will pay extra money for additional protections to guarantee protections. There are coyotes who may specialize in women who are pregnant, so that they kind of have safer passage, they find safer passage as well. So I'll let Gabriela take over there.
Thank you. I think more than, going back to the issue of, most of these parents did not really face prosecutions, right? I think more than the fear of prosecution is the fear, the if, what if? The fear that this may happen to you anytime, that if it already happened to a neighbor, it may happen to you. And the preparations that we see many families undertake, in preparation of a potential deportation, the potential arrest of a family member, and having to live that way. What we know about that past operation was that 12 cases were actually brought forward with smuggling charges. We don't know if those cases were actually, if anybody was prosecuted, at the end for facilitation. That is in terms of the first question. We see, and just to kind of follow up on the smuggling of children, what we also see, and this is something that, once again, that very monolithic notion that we have about smuggling often obscures, is that even within the smuggling, there's hierarchies of protection. The people who can pay more money, those who cannot pay any money, those, and here I'm going to kind of connect, Chris, to your question, some migrants who see becoming or entering drug trafficking activities as a way to pay their fees as they go. So many times, once again, I hear that the narrative of trafficking is brought on board, saying they were forced, they were coerced. We are not saying, and please do not think that that is what we are suggesting, that migrants are not being forced on occasion. But what we have also been able to document is that for those who have no social and no financial capital, for the migrants who have absolutely nothing to rely on, who really are trying to cross the border, assisting drug trafficking organizations has been a strategy. They get paid an amount of money. We have documented, and in fact, part of our work on the article, and here again, another promo, is the experience, the testimony of a woman who went to, those who of you who are familiar with the U.S.-Mexico border, she went to work at a garlic farm, where she was, so that she could save money, so that she could pay then to cover her fee. And within the farm, somebody approached her and told her, you just need to carry a bag. You just need to carry a bag, and you're going to get to this other location. And when she was asked what was in the bag, by friends or family members, there's here another layer, stigma. Do you think I am going to tell my family members that I was carrying drugs? Do you think, how am I going to feel by the time I get to my destination to say, yes, I was working with drug traffickers, that's how I made it? So there's, of course, also the silencing that many times takes place, the strategies that people have to rely on so that they can continue on their paths towards mobility. I hope that kind of addressed one of the dimensions.
Sheldon, anything else you want to add?
That's so true. I wanted to dovetail what Gabriela said. The migrants who have the least resources oftentimes will wind up helping the drug trafficking organizations. That's just a common strategy. Nobody really forced them to do it, but it becomes a convenient route to do it. Back to Luisa said, and also Gabriella's mentioned that the corruptions. Yes, corruptions is very good. I mean, not very good. It's the lubricant that works well in an unregulated market space. You need that as more demand for such illicit services emerges or increases. There's a greater demand for corrupt services. That becomes a necessity to doing business. Back to the questions over there about the use of visas and formal migration. Yes, it is true as you tighten the borders, restricting the illegal border crossings, and there'll be greater use of regular formal migration routes. This is especially the case with, for instance, the Chinese human smuggling activities. Nowadays, with the 10-year visas, a lot of people just take the visa and come over and overstaying it. That's still one major glitch in terms of our border control, where we issue visas and we really don't match the ones who leave the country with the visas they came into this country with. In other words, there's no exit track, whereas in many other countries, especially if you go to China, like I do most of the times, when you need permission to enter the country, you also need permission to leave the country. Whereas in this country, nobody bothers if you want to leave the country. But when you enter the country, yes, you can carry a temporary or non-working visas, but nobody tracks when or if you ever leave. So that becomes a major loophole. See, a lot of people come here and overstay in their visas. That becomes a common route for migrant smuggling. Nowadays, you don't hear Chinese being offloaded like Long Island off the Golden Ventures. They don't do that type of human smuggling anymore. Now it just goes through. There are plenty legal means to do so. And back to the question that Tom raised earlier in terms of the ebb and flows of the illegal smuggling. For any demographers or social scientists, if you look at the migration data, you will know that illegal migration responds more to the economic conditions of the U.S. as opposed to border enforcement. Now, I'm not saying that border enforcement does not have an impact on illegal border crossing.
Sure.
It does. But to a greater extent, it actually responds to the economic conditions within the U.S. economy. And after all, our country does use a lot of unregular or irregular labor force, agriculture, construction, landscaping, you name it, babysitting, restaurant business. I mean, and a whole gamut of industries that use labor force that occupied mostly by immigrants, either legal or illegal. So back to Tom's question earlier, that the ebb and flow of the illegal migration has more to do with the economic conditions of the U.S. Domestic market as opposed to border enforcement.
I would also add something on that, is that when you ask what percentage of the migrants are trafficked, it depends very much on these fees that we're talking about. And when people are being charged fees that they can't possibly have, some of them may carry drugs, but that's not what is going on, I think, in a large percentage. But some of them wind up being trafficked or becoming like indentured servants to pay off their debt. And a lot of that is going on in the labor trafficking area. And we don't know enough about it. We've been focusing mostly in the U.S. on sex trafficking, when much of the exploitation that pays for this human smuggling is in the labor trafficking area.
That's a very good point. And to the other point, I think that Gabriela is making, my impression, I know Guadalupe's written about this, is that women do engage in sex work as a way to finance their travels, as horrific as that may sound to a lot of us, and it doesn't mean they're necessarily, by legal definition, being trafficked, unless it's under coercion and under false pretense and for the exploitation for someone else. So there's a lot of complex issues there. And Sheldon, you're reminding me, one of the things that I think the press in the last few days has been a little bit confused about has been, why isn't Mexico doing more to prevent people from leaving Mexico? And I responded along the line, well, the United States doesn't prevent people from leaving the United States. I mean, Mexico's not going to put people at the border and say, you can't leave your own country. And I think there's a lot of confusion around that as well. Now, you're required to have go through an orderly process to leave Mexico, but it's a different situation. Just one last plug for Guadalupe Correa Cabrera's paper that deals a lot with these issues of distinguishing between smuggling and trafficking. I wanted to acknowledge her research colleague as well, Artur Sanders Montandon, and then also my colleague Jacqueline Dolezal, who was in charge of editing and layout and all the design work. Thank you very much for that help. Andrea Tonko for her great support in organizing this event. Alan Atkinson, even though he's a Dallas Cowboys fan, he does a good job despite that. Thank you, Alan, and all the AV folks for your help. And then our tremendous team of interns. I'll just name them off. Nina Gordon, Mariana Sanchez right here, Christina Melendez, who's our communications intern, and Rachel Chauffet, I think I saw. I don't know if I missed. Oh, there she is. Thank you. I don't know if I'm missing anyone else, but thank you all. It's been a great panel. We will post this online. The papers are online. Anything you want to know about the event will be online. Live on in eternity on YouTube. So please consult. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.